fantasy short stories. Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron. Chapter 28, A Fond Farewell. Atlas had lost count of the days and nights spent locked behind the Grand Echo Resort and Spa's doors, but as he dropped his single small bag of stolen toiletries to the ground, he stared through that imposing doorway at the busy street beyond, and a pang of, was it homesickness? Excitement? An undercooked hot dog coming back to haunt him? Well, whatever it was, it clasped tight around his chest, making his breath catch. He scratched at his itchy, rose-colored robe. He'd been forced to return his uniform. He looked over his shoulder to see Undine standing off to his left, once again resplendent in her red armor, but the other dryad was nowhere to be seen. He was just about to ask when his attention snagged on something far more pressing. Miranda walking towards them, the pair of burly ogre guards hot on her heels. She was dressed in a crisp black pantsuit that was bedazzled with red gems and sequins to match her gossamer veil. Her hair was loose and curly, her snakes wrapped around her forehead, creating a scaly crown. She paused before him, popping out her hip to one side and folded her arms across her chest. Atlas, try as he might, couldn't fight the flick of his tongue across his lips as he looked up at that decorated curtain that hid her face. "Well, why are you standing around clogging up my foyer?" Miranda gestured to the newly repaired glass doors with a lazy wave. "The sooner you all get out, the happier I will be." He had just the response prepared when Atlas was interrupted by the sound of someone stumbling down the main staircase. "Sorry, I'm here!" Lucas jumped to his feet, rushing across the lobby to reach them. He smiled as he shouldered his bag, clutching at the strap. "I had to grab my dad." Miranda scowled at the sight of the sneaky little dryad. "Good. Now you can leave." Atlas held up a finger. "No, we can't. We're still waiting on the robot." When Miranda's only response was a pouting huff, he smiled and waved the other two off to the side for a private conversation. "Okay, so I've been doing some thinking. Wonders never cease." Ignoring Undine, Atlas continued as if nothing was said. "That in order for us to leave the Infernal Realm, we're going to have to locate a travel agency." He dropped his hand. "My great-uncle Pete owns one, but as far as I know, it's 2 cities over, and..." He sighed. He doesn't do family discounts." "You can't just magic us out of here?" Lucas turned his head, struggling to hear the Arcanist over the general hum of the hotel's busy lobby. Being down an implant wasn't a huge deal, but it did cause him mild discomfort and made sideline conversation difficult. "I thought you figured out how to fix your spells." "That's the problem. I may have found a workaround for some general magic, but the more complex the spell, the more complex the workaround. And planar hops are designed for places that exist physically. The Infernal Realm is between worlds, so technically it's neither planar nor physical." Atlas scratched at his eye patch. "I mean, I could try a small local hop to test the theory, but there's a good chance whoever goes through might exit the other side, inside out." "Let's figure it out along the way. I want to leave." Undine shot a scowling look at the nearest Sasquatch bellhop. When the hairy ape realized he had been noticed, he jumped, stumbling back into a pile of suitcases. "I see you, Rufus!" She pointed 2 fingers at her own eyes, then reversed them towards him. "I still owe you for tattling on me." A smile replaced her scowl when the bellhop let out a startled cry, grabbed the nearest pile of luggage, and began hauling them up the stairs without the customer. Atlas nodded, stroking his chin as he began to move the puzzle pieces in his mind. "Travel agencies are expensive, but if we get jobs in the city, we might be able to afford it in, say, 3 months, assuming I can find a cousin willing to let us sleep on their couch. Otherwise, rent will screw us." and if your impish family members won't help us, what will we do then? Undine, who had arrived with nothing, had nothing to occupy her hands with, so she folded them around her chest to keep from fidgeting nervously. This plan was becoming more convoluted by the moment. The ding of the elevator echoed across the lobby, and the door slid back, allowing Bram to come trundling out towards them.
Ahoy, mates!
He waved them down, then rolled up next to Lucas and stage-whispered conspiratorially,
I suggest we egress this premises, for the powers that be catch wind of the trinkets I've liberated into me pockets, eh?
At the sound of rattling bottles coming from their metal companion's chest, Lucas barked a silent laugh as he realized the robot had likely cleared the kitchens of rum. He turned back to the Arcanist, his chuckles fading. There has to be a faster way than that. Ahem! Rolling her eyes, Miranda shook her head slightly, her veil tickling her neck, and gestured to the bodyguards. The two ogres marched forward, pushed against each of the grand doors, and held them open. She waved towards the opening somewhat forcefully, trying to imply that now was the part where they left and never came back. Oh, fine, we're leaving. Atlas snatched his bag up and started moving towards the door. Oh, Lucas fell in line. What about that portal thing your crazy ex was screaming at you about? Stopping mere inches from the door, earning himself a long, exasperated groan from the hotel manager, Atlas spun on the Dryad. That psycho wasn't my ex, and I have no idea what portal she was talking about. The first portal was the rift created by Rivaria and Ciara when they fled their realm into the Enshrined Wilds, Undine mentioned offhandedly, her childhood lessons burned into her skull. If such a thing existed, it would take us directly into the Wild Queen's domain. But it has never been found, even by those who reside in the Autumn Expanse. Whatever Atlas's response was, it became a dull hum in Lucas's ear as something clicked into place in his thoughts. Autumn Expanse. It wasn't that long ago that he had taken a nap in room 1294, even though it felt like months. But he had held on to that memory because of the promise he had made in it. He looked up at his half-sister. These enshrined wilds, is it trees, as far as the eye can see, with a giant one in the center, and all the leaves are fall colors? The two dryads had said those words together, and Undine frowned at him. How do you know? You said you went from there. Atlas huffed and turned to leave. Whatever. We can discuss this once we find a place to sleep for the night. Lucas's eyes shifted quickly from his sister over to the Arcanist, and he could feel the rush of excitement bubbling up. Atlas had one foot outside the building, and, as Miranda had made it painfully clear, once they left, they were banned from returning. He snatched out a hand, wrapping his fingers around the sleeve of that awful, faded pink robe, and hauled back. Stumbling, and in danger of exposing himself to a crowded lobby, Atlas whirled around quickly, catching his balance and flinging closed his rosy apparel. What the hell was that for? He straightened out his garments, shifting the collar of his robe so that it revealed a tantalizing V of skin from neck to navel. What? Lucas turned his head so that the ear with the remaining functioning implant could hear, and said, Remember, you need to speak into this one, or you need to look at me when you talk so I can read your lips. A sheepish blush crept over Atlas's face, and he cleared his throat. Sorry? I asked why you stopped me. We can't leave yet. Lucas smiled, tapping the Arcanist on his shoulder to show he appreciated the apology. He then shifted, returning his attention to the overbearing Gorgon and the vein bulging in her neck. Her snakes began to coil and uncoil impatiently, and he swore he heard an agitated hissing coming from them. But he threw on his brightest smile and said, I forgot to pack something. We're just gonna double-check that we all have everything, and we'll be right back. Lucas didn't give the others further explanation, but instead turned around and began ushering them towards the lobby elevator. Atlas jogged to keep up. Listen, if we're going to reach my great-uncle Pete in any amount of decent time, we should leave.
We can't leave. Not yet.
With no shortage of confused looks, they piled into the cramped compartment, and he pressed the button for floor 12.
First, we have to take a nap.
Atlas spent the next 15 minutes trying to divine what the dryad meant. But, crammed into the back of the only functioning elevator, he didn't have even a breath to ask the man as much. He groaned with each ding of the bell. On the second floor, a woman and several children had entered, and the little crotch goblins had pushed every button, causing them to stop at each floor on their way to level 12. But, at long last, the four of them squeezed their way past the guests to spill out onto a faded runner. Each floor contained increasing levels of magic, used to fit the needs of the guests, the staff, or management. The Mint Ranch was housed on level 9. The fabled Bathhouse Chateau took up all of the 14th floor. There was no 13th, and here on level 12 were the rooms for only the wealthiest of patrons, each door resembling an entrance to a cathedral.
I still don't know what we're doing here.
Atlas shot a glance at the back of the dryad's head, and then up at his mechanical companion.
Do you?
Bram stroked his non-existent beard with a low murmur of thoughts.
Perhaps the quartermaster really is in need of a nap. That, or he's gone mad from scurvy.
Lucas laughed, trailing his hand along the wall for support. He had his head cocked to the right, angling his remaining implant towards their conversation, and gestured to a room at the end of the hall.
So a while back, I made a deal with the Puckwudgie, and after promising him an arm and a leg,
he approached the heavily boarded-up door and reached through the slats, turning the knob.
He showed me this.
As the door flung open inward, they were assaulted by humid, swampy air and the sounds of birds and insects. Atlas felt his jaw go slack as he squeezed beneath a wooden slat and into a room that could hardly be inside a building. He was staring at a jungle. He brushed a hand against the frond of a nearby plant, jerking back when he realized it was alive. This wasn't the same as the Mint Ranch, where everything had been a facsimile. These were real. Undine and Lucas had followed, watching with pained expressions as Bram, struggling to do the same, ended up forcing his way through by breaking several of the boards and knocking down the out-of-order sign. Turning to where a moth-eaten couch was losing the battle against creeping ivy vines, Lucas led the three of them towards the shining, glittering portal.
"Welcome to the cleaning crew's nap room."
He chuckled.
"Funny story, but I accidentally fell through that thing the other day, and I got a pretty good view of what I think is your enshrined wilds before the magic of the hotel snapped me back to the lobby. I only saw it for a split second, but how many places could match that description?"
In all of Atlas's years of school, though he had slept through most of it, the story of Rivaria and Thiara was always one of the most debated topics of ancient history. How had the two goddesses fled from their world into this one? What became of their reality? The scholars knew that the two deities had once been ethereal gods before somehow appearing in the flesh, something that should have been impossible. He touched the shimmering surface, feeling the ancient magic tickle his fingers. Here was the answer. The rent that had allowed them to escape into the tangible. "This is the first portal?" Undine nodded, recognizing several dancing shapes that flickered across the surface. "How do we do this? One at a time, or—" Atlas opened his mouth, but Lucas spoke up instead.
"I think we all came here together."
He held out both of his hands, offering one to his sister and the other to the Arcanist.
"We should leave together."
He smiled when, failing to come up with a reason not to, they both took his hands, Bram latching onto his bag, and he turned. He closed his eyes, sucking in one deep lungful of the humid air, and acting before his rational mind could convince him otherwise, Lucas jumped.
Pop! Pop, pop, pop!
The sound and the feel of rushing wind around them forced Lucas to open his eyes, with great watery effort. The lush, fall-colored canopy of the enshrined wilds was sprawled out beneath them, a giant tree rising like a skyscraper, just like before. Except there was something he hadn't realized the last time. Seeing the forest beneath them meant they were above it. Far above it, and it was approaching them quickly and not in the way any of them wanted. They were falling. Ah! Hold on to me! Atlas wriggled free a hand, his hair whipping in his face as he struggled to draw a rune in the air. The thing about magic and conjuring runes is that calm intent is needed. Clearly picturing a destination is crucial, and falling from the sky made doing all of that more difficult. Sure, back in school they had dared each other to jump off the high balcony overlooking the Grand Hall and try to zap to the ground before the safety spells caught them, but this was a lot higher. And there was nothing to keep them from becoming red smears when they landed. But despite that, the magic sizzled to life, and with a tight, gut-wrenching pull, they were all sucked into a planar hop. Got it! Pop, 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 pop! Ah! Once again, the dryad screamed right in his ear. Okay, so maybe he should have paid more attention in practical magic and conjuration classes. They were now, all four of them, falling from an even greater height, several miles east of where they had started, clouds whipping past them as a patchwork of colors, previously easily discernible as trees, was flying up to greet them. Do something! Lucas shouted over the rushing wind, cinching his death grip on the Arcanist's robes. Okay, calm down! Atlas wriggled free his hand, struggling to trace the rune in the air, the speed of their descent making it all the more difficult to focus. Pop, 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 pop. Ah! Pop, 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 pop. It was 6 more planar hops, including a spectacular aerial view of the open ocean, before they were all deposited unceremoniously into the dirt from a height of only several inches. His own back draped across a log, Atlas clutched at his chest, struggling to capture his breath. He managed several curses at the gods for creating aerial portals, however. Well, that was fun. No wonder the damned thing was so hard to find. Undine had landed atop the robot, and the two were fighting with one another to be the first to stand. But Lucas had been caught by a giant frond bush, which gently lowered him down to his feet. He stared at it until he heard a tiny, squeaky voice say, "You're welcome." He turned his attention away from his companions, aware that all 3 of them were safe and alive, to stare up at the fall canopy. Leaves drifted lazily around them, falling silently like snow on a cold winter's morning. He reached out and grabbed one, turning it over in his hands. There was a sense of something. Lucas spun on the spot, turning his right ear towards where he swore he heard whispers, but it was too faint. He felt like he had been here before. No, that wasn't right. It felt like a half-remembered dream, the details slipping through his fingers, but it called to him nonetheless, as comfortable to him as his own greenhouse back home. A place of sanctuary from the world outside. That's when he noticed elegant lampposts, the glass holding hundreds of glittering fireflies, and his breathing stalled. He was brought back to a moment in his past with blue lanterns and carefully strung Christmas lights. Lucas shook the thoughts away, returning to the present, and found that in his days he had approached that lamp. His fingers were tracing the intricate carvings of leaves and vines as he scanned around for his sister. Undine? He only saw more lamps, a path lined with glittering bricks, and silky curtains draped across several trees. Where are we? His voice came out quieter as confusion and terror began to creep into his awareness. She could tell the moment they'd landed, from the trees to the stone path, where they were. We should not be here. Standing on her own 2 feet at last, Undine approached her brother with the intent of pulling him back to the group, but froze when his hands slowly went into the air in surrender. And then she saw it, the glint of silver arrows knocked and ready to fire from all around them. Then the blade of a sword was pressed against Lucas's neck, at the robot's side, and over the Arcanist's stomach, but none were aimed at her, which did not reassure her any. Quite the opposite. Undine growled when several Dryad guards stepped from the trees themselves. Ironbreaker. Her title fell from their mouths with vitriol, the very taste of it poison on their lips. She clicked her tongue against her teeth, but her body fell into routine without thought, and she dropped to one knee, bowing her head. Even you are not allowed in the nursery, and to bring outsiders. One might construe this as treason. The Queen Sovereign will wish to speak with you. Oh my God! Winter looked over his shoulder at the pair of men hobbling along behind him. You two move slower than my granny in an airport on Christmas Eve. He paused, adjusting the cloak he wore around his waist like a sarong, a gift from the once Regent Lord. Can you move any faster? I don't fancy getting caught by them fairy folks again. With the great, controlled effort his years as a war general had taught him, Lucian resisted the urge to lash out physically. Not that he really could, leaning against his younger brother for support, his shoulder still screaming in agony. Instead, he settled on a hateful scowl and shot back, Rather than whinging about us moving faster, why don't you do something useful? Like, I don't know, waiting here to distract them by turning yourself in. Ha ha! Winter screwed up his face in mock amusement, then with a roll of his eyes turned back to the path before them. I thought elves were supposed to be agile and swift, not pathetic and whiny.
Listen, you flea-bitten mongrel,
Lucian cut in with a snarl, lurching forward in an attempt to wrap his fingers around the mutt's neck. His little brother halted his steps, but he continued with his words.
I was more than happy to leave you back there, locked up and left to the mercy of the Dark Fae. But no.
He dragged out that word with a petulant whine.
We had to rescue you two. So perhaps you could show a little gratitude by, keeping your thoughts to yourself.
Varen tugged back on his brother, shifting to return Lucian's weight to his own shoulder. He wasn't faring much better, and the werewolf's incessant nagging was beginning to fray on his patience. He stuck out his free hand, waving between the two to interrupt them and grab their attention, gesturing to the path when he had both. It wasn't much of a path, to be honest, but a thin game trail that ran alongside a steep cliff above the rushing river. You could tell they were still in the midst of the eventide court as tendrils of inky black swirled within the water. But he knew if they just continued heading in this direction, eventually they would reach the outer borders of the Wild Queen's domain. I am grateful. That's why I'm offering to carry you. With this wraith thingy, I'm super pumped and full of energy.
I would sooner gild myself than let a half-naked dogman carry me into the Wild Queen's domain like a lost child.
And whose fault is that, I wouldn't be half-naked if you hadn't thunk. Winter spun from the impact as a wooden shaft slammed through his shoulder, the bolt tip jutting out just beneath his collarbone. His blood splattered the two brothers as he stumbled and collapsed to one knee, crying out in pain. Tightening his grip on his brother, Varen scanned the trees. The attack had come from ahead of them, not behind. A monstrous groan shattered the silence, followed by the sound of splintering wood and the rushing of wind in their direction. He had only a moment to react as he dove, hauling Lucian with him as they tumbled into a bush off to his right. A massive tree trunk ripped from the soil, slammed into the ground directly where the pair had been standing moments before. Calming his hammering heart, Varen watched as the tree teetered on the spot before toppling over the ravine and down into the rushing waters below.
Is that you, Hollow?
Lucian was shouting now as he pulled himself free of the thorn bush. He scanned around for anything to use as a weapon, but their neat little path was barren of even large rocks. He stumbled himself into something that resembled a defensive posture.
Back to let me finish what I started.
Stepping out of the darkness and into a beam of golden moonlight, Hollow sneered down at his prey. Varen recoiled in horror, his hands scrambling to find purchase on his brother's arm. The dark Fey prince was mangled and scarred, blistered and bruised. One side of his body was atrophied, his missing wing having been replaced with strips of silken cloth woven between an intricate silver latticework. This once proud future leader was nothing more than a rage-fueled specter of death. Lucian knew in his state he couldn't fight or flee, but perhaps he could distract the Fae long enough for the others to escape. A terrible smile curled his features as he nodded to the prince.
Nice wing. I can't wait to pluck the other.
You! That one word fell from Hollow's trembling lips with great difficulty. His mind was a swirling tempest of impossible anger. He raised a hand to the soldiers ambling to a stop behind him. Swords were drawn, crossbows were leveled, and Kalos had stomped into view, slamming down the Shade Eater's iron cage at the front of the line. A grin cut across the puckered flesh of Hollow's face, cruel and sharp, followed by a bout of hysterical laughter.
You will all die screaming.
He laughed when the swordsmith ripped open the door of the cage and shadows erupted from the teal flames with hungry purpose. A half-dozen soldiers in silver, rune-covered armor surged forward, corralling the beasts forward. Lucian grabbed the bag of white stones and scattered them along the path between them and the revenants that barreled towards them. He had no idea if they worked that way, but what other choice did he have? The closest one found itself being drawn in towards the glittering gem. It dug deep trenches in the earth with its dagger claws, all the while screaming as it was pulled into the stone with a comical pop. This caused the remaining Shade Eaters to slow their pace as more were sucked away to their doom, at last coming to a stop just out of reach of the white stone barrier. Hollow screamed in rage, snatching up the nearest crossbow from a stunned soldier and took aim at the elven regent, loosing the bolt. Time slowed to a sickening pace as Varen watched the projectile fly through the air towards his brother. Acting on instinct, he shoved Lucian aside. Time resumed its steady march as the bolt slammed into his chest, knocking him back several steps. His breath hitched in his throat as he stared down at the wooden shaft that impaled him just below his heart. Then his footsteps carried him over the edge of the ravine, the ground crumbling under his weight. Lucian flung out a hand, attempting to latch hold of his brother, but his fingertips only brushed open air as Varen disappeared below. With a cry of frustration, rage, and despair, he dove in after him. If they lived through this, he was going to kill him. Winter, who had managed to drag himself towards the sheltering shadows of the trees, watched his escorts swan dive into the river, and he let out a long, angry growl. Ah, hell! Granted a boost of energy by Wraith, he flung himself out into the open, avoiding several arrows by sheer luck alone, and reenacted his high school swim team's winning performance. As their dryad escorts marched them through several tall, elaborate doors, Lucas could have sworn they were still outside. Thick trunks rose like support columns to a high ceiling above, enchanted to resemble the glow of the setting sun. Winding across the sky were twisting branches draped in golden vines that reached down into the soil, each one glittering with oscillating lights. He squinted at the closest one to see that they were small insects moving about, light glinting off their jeweled carapaces. A flash of movement drew Lucas's attention away from the bugs to see a small plant-like child staring at their party with wide, curious eyes. The only way his mind could rationalize what he was looking at was to compare the creature with a bonsai tree that had sprouted arms and legs. A prod in his spine convinced him back into motion as the little creature was whisked away by a thin, wispy dryad woman with long, white hair. He had so many questions. Most importantly was, why does this place feel familiar? Lucas reached out, tugging at the elbow of Undine's armor. Where are we? He chose to get the answer to the simplest question first. And how much trouble are we in? Her jaw was clenched painfully tight, the inklings of a migraine setting in at the base of her skull as Undine looked down at her little brother. Her plans to return to the Wild Queen had not included a trip to Summerfell. She breathed in deeply through her nose before answering. This is the birthplace of all dryads. It is where I was born, and where our mother was born. The itch of concern and fear crept up Lucas's neck, and he bit his lip to keep it contained. You don't look pleased. Undine barked a laugh. You could say that. I'm not exactly welcome here. My child. A voice pulled their entire procession to a halt. You know that isn't true. Child? At those words, Lucas's gaze snapped up towards the speaker, a hopeful butterfly shivering to life in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, she was his mother, though he wasn't certain he wanted to see her. Not after she abandoned him and his father and never came home. But a small part of him, the one that longed for family, was prepared to see her standing there. That little hopeful flutterbug in his chest died quickly as his gaze landed on a woman who was definitely not his mother. She was short, plump, and gray-skinned, with dark brown hair and ebony horns that sprouted up from her hairline. The pleasant-looking woman was garbed in a lilac-colored dress with a train long enough to drape over the edge of the ivory dais she stood on. Tiny purple flowers adorned strands of silver that were strung around and across her horns, giving her crown the feel of morning dew on spiderwebs. Her eyes were the same color as her dress, and her smile was warm like fresh honey. Liliana? Undine gave a curt bow, one arm folded over her chest. The woman stepped down from the dais, moving closer to their party. She turned at the sound of her name, her smile only growing fonder. Undine, my heart warms to see you well. Your aunt will be most pleased to see you. She scoffed with a barely hidden roll of her eyes. My aunt banished me for being a bastard. She would not welcome me home, even if I escorted Ciara herself into your halls. You know you weren't cast out for your blood. The Wild Queen, fearing for the safety of her recently separated husband, wanted our strongest warrior. Liliana smiled and reached up, touching Undine's face. No purpose could be greater than serving the will of the Wild Queen. Her smile faded slightly, shifting into a knowing sadness. You were meant for more than a life stuck inside, tending to the newborns. Undine bit back the sneer that crawled across her skin. That was the same lie she'd been told back then. A grand purpose, a divine right. She wrinkled her nose at that, knowing full well the truth was that the Queen was ashamed of what she was. Of course, you are right. She was a child, and you sold her off. Lucas could see the tightness in his sister's jaw and the way her hand went to her forearm, to the brand hidden beneath her armor. He shot a glare back at the curvy woman with the honeyed words and smile. That is not purpose. That's slavery. Her hand fell away from Undine's face, and Liliana turned to take in the one that spoke, her smile faltering as her eyes went wide. It had been half a century since a male dryad had graced the halls of Summerfell, and now one, even if he was half-blooded, stood before her. A frown tugged gently at her brow. Who are you? Does it matter? Her strong accent muddled the words in his hearing ear, and Lucas found her lips difficult to read.
I get the feeling we aren't exactly welcome.
Her eyes drifted along the familiar features, the curve of his nose to the full shape of his lips, until they landed on a rectangle of gold that dangled from his right ear. Stamped there was the royal symbol, a sprouting seed, and Liliana's attention whipped back to take in the male dryad in full. She could see it now. Despite the color of his hair and eyes, he looked just like his mother. Not to mention he shared the same firebrand temper.
You must be a child of Calliope.
Liliana shook her head and gave him a smile, offering up her ringed hand.
This is your home. Of course you are welcome here.
There was a moment of hesitation as Lucas glanced to Undine, who gave a slight nod before he took her hand in his, kissing the giant stone on her finger.
I must admit, your mother was always a favorite of mine, a free spirit. I was saddened when she left.
Lucas's frown deepened as he dropped her hand.
That makes one of us.
This is all very touching.
Atlas, leaning heavily against Bram from magic overuse, raised a hand tentatively.
But as I'm only 1/26th Dryad, can I go? I've got a friend to rescue and I'm exhausted.
He shot a look over to his friend.
You promised me a nap.
Liliana chuckled, moving her hand across her belly as it jiggled.
I'm afraid I cannot make that call. All of you were found in the nursery, and as I am not the sovereign queen, just her wife, you will have to petition her for mercy.
We need to... what? Lucas shot a wild glance up at his sister, hoping for explanation. It was in that moment, of course, a pair of guards off to their right hammered their spears against the stone floor to grab the attention of all.
Behold, the Tree Mother, Avatar of Ecrosia, and Sovereign Queen Opeli Stonebark!
The two dryads reached for the doors, pulling them open to allow entry to the most imposing woman Lucas had ever seen. His gaze flickered from his sister back to the figure striding towards them. They could have been twins for all their shared features. They had the same dark skin, white hair, but where Undine's horns curled back over her head, Opeli's were more like those of a ram, spiraling down around her ears.
We need to beg for mercy, for all the good it might do,
Undine hissed in her little brother's good ear, keeping her gaze locked with her aunt's.
You forget yourself, Ironbreaker.
Opeli approached them, the clacking of her heeled boots echoing sternly in the silence.
The nursery is forbidden to all, especially the banished, and yet you bring outsiders into our most sacred of groves?
She stopped before the gaggle of strangers, taking in each one, from the pale and drained human wizard being supported by an armored golem to the male dryad standing beside her bastard niece. She clicked her tongue at them all in disgust.
Your mother's name will not afford you anything here. She forfeited your standing the moment she failed to uphold her duties, when she shirked her responsibilities to throw herself at any available partner.
She gestured with her two fingers at the young man.
And judging by the looks of this one here, she birthed yet another bastard.
Rage, unlike anything he had felt before, flamed to life in Lucas's gut, and he lurched forward.
Listen here, you trollop!
Undine cast out a hand, halting her brother before he dug their collective grave any deeper, and dropped to one knee.
Our presence here is not intentional. We were cast afield on our way to the Wild Queen. Our trespass was accidental.
She glanced up. I ask that you allow us to continue on our mission, for it is vital that we reach her. Opeli scowled down at her.
What use would the Wild Queen have for one such as you?
Undine matched her steely gaze to that of her mother's kin.
A grander purpose. You insolent little... Opal, You really don't have to be so harsh, dear.
Liliana reached out, placing a hand on her wife's forearm.
No harm was done. Why not let them go with just a warning? If truly they are on business for the Wild Queen, granting mercy could be seen as a sign of good faith.
She gave Undine a sidelong glance, begging her to back down.
We do not allow outsiders in our home, Lily, let alone in the nursery.
Opelli leaned to hiss in her wife's ear.
If I am soft on this bunch, what will the outside world think? This is not the outside world, my love.
Liliana gestured to the still kneeling dryad.
She is your blood, your kin, and so is he.
Her fingers moved to the young man.
If not mercy, show them kindness.
An act that went against her very being, Opelli thought. But she sighed.
Ever the diplomatic one, Lily.
She patted her wife on the forearm before whirling back on the gaggle of strangers.
By the grace of my wife, I grant you leave to continue your mission.
She spat the last word.
Rise, Ironbreaker, and be on your way.
Her hand swung to the two dryads standing near the doors, gesturing for them to open them. When their procession began to move, Opelli tilted her weapon to bar the path of her bastard nephew.
Except for you.
Lucas's breathing hitched as he turned his gaze up to his imposing aunt.
What? Why? Half-breed or not, you are still a prince.
Opelli gestured at the trees around them.
And there are seeds that need your attention.
You've been listening to Of Risk and Relativity by Lesley Herron, Book 5 in the series here on Tall Tale TV. If you would like to listen to the entire book in one place, or any of her other novels, you can find them at talltaletv.com/series, or by following the links in the description.
So then I told the old man that if he wants fresh moonberries, he should go pick them himself.
You didn't? What did he say to that?
They told me I get picking or I get packing.
Is that why you dragged me out into the middle of dark Fae territory?
I mean, it wasn't for your glowing personality. Whoa, hold on.
You all right?
Oh, yeah, I'm all right. Just tripped on a root. Bloody trees everywhere. Oh, damn.
What's wrong?
I tore the buckle on my boot.
You did? Oh, quick, turn around 3 times and say your name backwards.
Do what? Why?
Everyone knows broken buckles bring bad luck. You have to do it or you'll be plagued by accidents for a fortnight.
You and your superstitious nonsense. Bah, this is like last week when I stepped on a fallen acorn and you said it meant I would receive a grievous injury.
To be fair, you did stub your toe the next day.
And what about the time we saw a flock of birds flying left to right and you said I was doomed to fall ill?
And 6 weeks later you had food poisoning.
It's just a broken buckle. I'm not doing some silly dance because you're superstitious.
But
nothing. What's the worst that could happen?
Look out!
By the gods! What in the name of Tiara was that?
It looked like a meadow golem, a dryad, and a really pale man.
They nearly crushed me. You said spin 3 times, right?
You stop screaming!